My name is Colin Oriens, and I am the director of the Environmental Studies program here at Tufts University. I welcome you all. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the Hoke Cunningham Environmental Lecture Series. This series is made possible to the generosity of two alumni siblings, Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke, who are both alumni of Tufts and parents of Tufts alumni. So today I get to introduce Daphne Hoke Cunningham, who's going to introduce today's speaker. But before I do that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So if you are new to this series and you want to receive alerts about upcoming talks, or if you're a student and want to receive the newsletter, we're putting a link in the chat and you could go to that chat and sign up for either one of those options. We often record our lectures, and so if you want to view a previous one or see this one recorded later, you can also go to the link in the chat to see the semester schedule and the recordings of previous talks. So today the chat is disactivated, so if you do have questions, which we hope you will have lots of questions, we encourage you to put them into the Q&A, and we will ask them and have a conversation with our speaker at the end. So it is my pleasure to introduce Daphne Hoke Cunningham. Daphne received her Bachelor's of Arts in French and in Art History from Tufts in 1982. And she and her husband, John Cunningham, are parents to one of Tufts alumni. They have 3 children, Nevin, Charles, who went to Tufts, and Ryan. Following her time at Tufts, Daphne entered the art field and was owner and director of the Hoke Sculpture International of New York and Chicago for 15 years. She migrated towards an interest in the natural sciences and became an environmental consultant and board member of the Bhutan Foundation, where she met today's speaker. Daphne has served on the National Council of the World Wildlife Fund, the Asia Society Associates, is currently on the corporation board of WHOI, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and is a member of the Explorers Club. She has a special interest in and friendship with the people of Bhutan, having first visited in 1973, and is particularly interested in the preservation of environment and culture. Daphne, welcome to the Hoke Cunningham Lecture Series, and thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Colin, for the nice introduction. As a Tufts alum and parent, I'm thrilled to speak to you today about my good friend, Dr. Pema Jamso. And now I just lost my notes. 1 second, please. Dr. Pema Jamso hails from Bhutan, which is the land known as the land of the Thunder Dragon. He has dedicated his career to environmental leadership, working at the interface of science, policy, and practice on topics like conservation, climate change mitigation, and village readiness for community-owned and managed forests. Highly regarded for being a man of his word, Dr. Jamso has faithfully served his country and government, honoring the wise leadership of both the 4th and now the 5th King of Bhutan, while working as a minister representing the interests of the people. He earned in 1990 a Master of Agricultural Sciences from Lincoln University in New Zealand, and in 1996, a PhD in Natural Science from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Switzerland. In 2008, he became the first Minister of Agriculture and Forests for the Royal Government of Bhutan under the newly elected democratic government. He subsequently served 2 terms as the leader of the opposition party. I first met Pema in 2007 at a dinner hosted by his wife, with whom I had just traveled across the length of Bhutan from the remote east to the capital in the west as part of a World Wildlife Fund expedition. After conversing and understanding that we shared a deep love for nature, for protecting the environment, and for traveling in Bhutan, he invited me to join a Ministry of Agriculture team trek in 2009 back to the eastern region bordering on Tibet, where due to its isolation, the nomadic yak herding culture is unique. We would drive 3 days from west to east and trek 3 days northeast to villages beyond roads, electricity, and sometimes running water, lofting a chant as we reached each mountain pass, La Gelo, victory to the gods, asking their blessing to enter their territory. I witnessed democracy in action as the Minister of Agriculture held village meetings, listening to people's requests. With his secretary taking notes, he granted wishes. One village head said they had lost many sheep last winter and no longer had enough wool to weave their traditional clothing. Minister said, I will have 100 head of sheep delivered. In another village, we were told that vegetables had been plentiful this spring, but families did not have a way to bring their crops to market. Could they have a road? Minister said with a chuckle, it took us 3 days to get here by foot. How shall I bring a road across these mountain passes? Instead, he suggested delivering 2 horses that could transport the vegetables to other villages for sale. Done. How easy, and all with jokes and laughter in between. Even in these tiny, difficult to access communities where prayer flags flutter, people smile and tease easily. They welcomed their minister with open arms and shared what they had, including singing and dancing around a bonfire. And eventually, their wish was granted. In 2019, I returned to the same region by road and witnessed the government's promise realized, running water and electricity in each village. Since retiring from his 30 years in government service, Dr. Jamso has become Director General of the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, in Kathmandu, Nepal, where he continues his work to preserve Himalayan natural environments. Pema, all yours.
Thank you very much, Daphne, for that glowing accolade. I don't know whether I deserve that or not, but let me first go to my screen and start my talk. Right, can you see? Is that good enough? Right, distinguished professors and students of Tufts University, alumni members, dear friends. As you have just heard my friend Daphne giving the introduction, I nearly felt like disappearing from this seat because I think I don't deserve half the things that she said, she mentioned. But to some extent, what she said describes the journey of Bhutan. I would say almost leapfrogging from the medieval ages to the 21st century. I'm going to tell this story about Bhutan, how, in spite of leapfrogging to the 21st century, it has still managed to retain most of its cultural values as well as its environment intact. So this is the story about Bhutan, and I'm going to go right through. I have called my talk, The Living in Harmony with Nature, Bhutan's Way. I'm going to give a short introduction of Bhutan, as some of you may not know where it is located. Then I'm going to describe the state of the environment that is there just now, the pathways to development that Bhutan has followed, what are the challenges that we are facing, and what we bring to the global table. And I would conclude with some statements. Now, as you know, Bhutan is a very tiny country located between China and India, China to the north, India to the south, and next to Nepal, but we don't share common borders with Nepal. So basically we are landlocked between China and India. This is only about 38,000 square kilometer in area with around 700,000 people, and the altitude range is between 200 to 7,500 meters. And we have a wide range of climate ranging from tropical in the south to alpine in the north. And we had constitutional democratic monarchy just now, but before that we had monarchy, and before that a dual system of government, which I am going to explain later. The economy even now is predominantly agricultural based, with modern sectors like hydropower and tourism chipping in. The state religion is Buddhism. Now I'm going to just describe you the status, the state of the environment that we have. Right now, Bhutan has probably one of the highest forest cover among the countries in the region and perhaps beyond, with about 72% of its area under tree cover. So that is actual forest. But if you include all the vegetation, including shrubs, it would be close to 80 or more. We have more than 50% of our land area under national parks and protected areas. And one of the parks that Daphne mentioned is where you saw those pictures. And only 7% of the land is suitable for agriculture. Out of that, I think only around a fraction of that, 2% is actually under cultivation. We have a wide range of biodiversity. About 200 mammal species are recorded, more than 600 species of birds, and also quite rich in freshwater fish species. We have over 5,600 species of flowering plants. The rivers are still quite pristine. In fact, those of you who have been to Thimphu, our capital, would also have noticed that even the river that runs through our capital is relatively clean compared to all the other rivers you might find in the region. Bhutan is proud that we are actually sequestering, absorbing more carbon than we emit. Right now, we actually sequester about 7,000 gigatons as compared to 7 gigatons as compared to 2 gigatons emission. So we are net negative in terms of carbon emission. How did we reach there? The pathways that we have adopted is not something accidental, but it is a combination of planning and design, as well as to some extent also by tradition. Religion has a lot to do with it, our belief. Even before Buddhism came to the country around the 8th century, there was a belief called the Bon religion. And that religion is actually the worship of spirits that dwell in forests, under trees, in ponds of water, in stones, cliffs, and so on. So every object has got its own special, considered the sanctuaries of deities and spirits. So they are very much, respected. And when Buddhism was introduced, you know that the center tenet, the core tenet of Buddhism is coexistence with all sentient beings and living in harmony with nature and having compassion and respect for life, and generally abhorrence of killing, hunting, or fishing in any form. Now, the political system, as I briefly alluded to earlier, was a dual system of governance existed until 1908, when monarchy was ushered in. With that, I mean there was a spiritual head who actually also had a lot of influence over the secular the governor or secular ruler. So there was secular ruler parallel with the spiritual ruler, but the spiritual ruler was actually the head of the state. Then we had monarchy until 2008, when the present form of governance, the constitutional democratic monarchy, was introduced since 2008. In terms of social structure, the country, in most part of the country, we have this matrilineal system of, the societal arrangement, where the daughters in the family still inherit most of the family's properties, including the land, family land. So this has also helped in terms of keeping the family property intact, in terms of managing the land, properly. The economy until recently was largely based on a barter system. People exchange goods with each other, like rice from the lower areas are traded with butter and cheese from the highland areas. So it was a barter form, and even now the economy is by and large semi-subsistence one. Sorry, the development policies and plans that are mostly designed. Now, this is where I think we have taken a different approach to many other countries. We have not just gone ahead with shortcuts in pursuit of material gains or economic growth. So we have adopted what is known as the gross national happiness philosophy. The gross national happiness basically is quite close to what the UN uses as the Human Development Index, or now where many countries are coming up with well-being and wellness and so on. So it is made up of 4 pillars. It's basically balancing those interlinked pillars. That is, first is of course sustainable economic growth is important, but sustainable and equitable economic development is one pillar, followed by the preservation and promotion of culture, then the preservation and conservation of the environment, and of course, good governance. So gross national happiness try to balance these 4 pillars, that we are not all out in pursuit of material growth, but that our spiritual concerns are taken care of. For example, we could have easily increased our revenue generation by cutting down the trees and selling the logs and timber, exporting that. But we didn't do that, and we have been banking on the indirect benefits of forests, such as in terms of protection of watersheds, water catchment areas, and reaping the benefits through generation of hydroelectricity and tourism. So we have also come up with a development strategy called the middle path. So this middle path, the document called the National Environment Strategy for Bhutan, developed sometime back in 1998, really charted out how we want to go, Vision 2020. So it has a vision up to 2020 in terms of what our macroeconomic policies would be, where our focus areas would be. So that is why we have focused on developing the hydropower potential of the country, because it is a renewable natural resource and one that Bhutan is abundantly endowed with. We are endowed with many rivers, and I think hydropower, the potential for hydropower generation is one of our main resource. The rivers are our main resource, so we have tried to use that. Then tourism, again, not sort of mass tourism, but also a little different, managed tourism and properly planned destinations and so on. The tourism actually started in Bhutan only in 1974. The first tourists arrived in Bhutan. And since then, we have been consciously following the policy of high value, low volume. Basically, it is not about restricting tourists and keeping them out, but it is about managing the tourists who come in, because we didn't have actually that many hotels until recently. We didn't have roads. We didn't have the kind of infrastructure, and including restaurants or guides, to actually support mass tourism. So therefore, we have the tourists who come to Bhutan actually pay much higher than when they go to other countries or neighboring countries. But I believe that they get their value for money. So that is a policy that we still follow. Mostly group and guided tours, but now we are also revisiting that in view of many developments. Now our capacity is much more, and we have many more hotels and many more vehicles also. And also we could also fly in. If you look back, the first roads to Bhutan came in 1960s, early 60s. The first vehicles entered Bhutan in 1960s. The first plane landed in Bhutan in 1980s. And the internet services and email services, all that came only towards the late 90s. And the social media, everything. I think now we are caught up with the world. Now we have Facebook, we have Twitters, and we have Instagram, we have WhatsApp, WeChat, whatnot. So we are caught up with the rest of the world. But before that, we didn't even have that kind of communications system. And of course, as I already mentioned, the energy policy very much geared towards saving the forest resources. Hydropower and also use of liquid petroleum gas and biogas for cooking, and reduced dependence on firewood. That is the objective. So we try to save our forests. Then agriculture development policy, of which I'm proud to say I'm very much part of the agriculture development planning and development policies. We have consciously followed a development path that is sustainable, that is nature-based. We are talking about nature-based solutions now, but we have been following that all along. So since the early 90s, we have embarked on a path of developing integrated soil nutrient management, basically focusing more on organic sources of nutrients rather than chemical fertilizer. Similarly, on organic and biological forms of controlling pests and diseases rather than using chemicals like pesticides and weedicides. And livestock development was consciously geared towards reducing the number of grazing animals and increasing productivity per head. So we have introduced some high yielding breeds, and we have also introduced high yielding pasture species. So basically, in the past, what people used to do is used to own large herds of cattle, and they are actually let out into the forest for grazing. And to regenerate grass, the pastures, they used to set fire to this forest every 3 to 4 years. So there was hardly any forest cover around village settlements. But now everywhere, right up to the village boundaries, we have green forest covers like this. So if you happen to visit Bhutan, this is the village that I was born and where I grew up. It is in a valley called Tang Valley in Bumthang, central part of Bhutan. Legislations, of course, again, to support the policies, we have consciously drawn up legislations that support our, middle path development philosophy and policies. The Forest Act was one of the first piece of legislation that was introduced in Bhutan. So it was really mainly focused on protection and banning of forest fires at that time, and I think that was very much needed. When that act was introduced, then somehow the forest fires, deliberate setting of fires were controlled. And as you can see, most of the forests in Bhutan are relatively young. I think 20 to 30 years of age because of the regeneration from banning these forest fires. The Forest Act 1969 as well as 1983 was mostly focused on protecting and policing and controlling burning and illegal felling. But in 1995 we came up with a more comprehensive Forest and Nature Conservation Act, which also encourages the participation of communities in management of forests. So instead of government forest officials going around patrolling and policing, it is the communities themselves who now are given ownership of certain areas of forest, and they protect the forest from fires. They decide what is to be harvested and so on, and they also get the benefits. And of course, there is a strict law, rules against hunting and trade in wildlife. So all this also helped protect the forest. National Environment Protection Act. Now, every project that our government implements has to go through very vigorous environmental impact assessment. So projects sometimes get held up for several years because they are not able to ratify the requirements for, qualifying for this, certification from the environmental agency. However, I think this has paid dividends in the long run because I think the impact of all our development on our environment is still very minimal because of that. The Land Act in many ways also helped protect the environment because our Land Act is geared towards not expanding the agricultural land or expanding other economic activities into the state land or into community land, but rather in consolidating the land that is already under cultivation. So promoting high yielding species as well as intensifying the land use through farm mechanization and irrigation and so on. Please let me know when I'm running short of time. Give me a warning. And of course, now this is where my friend comes in. Daphne and her family has been associated with Bhutan's development since since modernization started, if you like. in the 60s and 70s. Her grandparents were involved, then her parents are involved, and now she herself is involved, and hopefully the next generation would get involved in Bhutan's development as well. But one of the ways that Bhutan approaches development financing is also that we are very selective in terms of choosing where our money should come from. So we have these roundtable meetings where we invite the donors and then see whether their priorities matches our priorities. And if they don't, then I think we quite politely, but I think bravely, sort of say that thank you, we will get back to you later, that kind of approach. So we just don't take in, all the low-lying fruits that are there, but what is actually required. And also innovative financing mechanisms, especially for the environment, like the Bhutan Trust Fund for Environmental Conservation, that has helped finance most of the conservation projects, as well as the parks and protected areas. And where again Daphne was involved, the Bhutan Foundation. I believe she is now, I don't know whether I should mention, but going to be the president of this foundation very soon. So hopefully we will see her many more times here. And recently we also established the Bhutan for Life. This is, I think, one of its kind in the world, perhaps one of the first, again with the support of WWF, World Wildlife Fund for US, and friends in the United States. We actually helped set this financing mechanism up. And the idea was conceived during my time, because what we felt is, with politics, the chances of not getting enough funding for the parks and protected areas become more likely. So in order to safeguard that the parks and protected areas, the conservation is being funded regardless of regardless of which party comes to power, we have set up this fund basically to provide continuity to funding the conservation programs. And we have also incorporated mechanisms of plowing back revenues that are generated from the hydropower, from logging, from mining, and from tourism. So it is not free of challenges. I think we are facing many more challenges than perhaps many other countries. The socio-economic drivers, we are not spared. The influences of globalization, the economic development, the need for material growth, economic growth, the increase in employment, and so on. So unemployment is becoming a serious issue, particularly youth unemployment. And I think at the moment that I would consider is one of the biggest challenges for the country. And of course, with urbanization, several other problems set in, including juvenile delinquency and all sorts of small crimes and so on. We are also on the increase, as well as pollution and other challenges. Of course, the biggest challenges that not only Bhutan but the whole Hindu Kush Himalayan region is facing is the impact of climate change. The impacts are felt much more acutely here, much more here because of the elevation. And the melting of snow and glaciers are taking place faster than anywhere else. And that is true in Bhutan. In the mid-90s, when I was doing my PhD research on the border with China, I could actually have to, I in fact have to walk through snow, but now almost all these areas are devoid of any snow cover. So in front of your eyes, you see the glaciers melting, the snow cover disappearing. Now, with that comes increasing incidences of glacial lake outburst floods, so-called globs, flash floods, storms, and so on, and also many more incidences of wildfires and so on. So Bhutan is seriously facing problem with either experiencing too little water or too much water, which is a problem that is being faced across the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. In concluding, I would say again, Bhutan has leapfrogged to the 21st century. Today, if you visit Bhutan, you would see that herders are using mobile phones at 4,500 meters. They are connected. And as Stephanie has mentioned, some of the most remote villages are now connected with road. And grid electricity has reached almost every nook and corner of the country. And we have achieved universal enrollment of children in schools. universal access to clean and safe drinking water. Around 98% of our households have piped water. And we have also, one of the, I think, just a little joke. In the 70s, when our life expectancy was recorded, say like 48 years, life expectancy, official record was 48 years. Someone was studying in Australia and then referring to this 48 years life expectancy.
My apologies, everyone. We seem to have lost him temporarily. He had a power outage this morning that he's using a backup battery, so we're hoping he'll come back shortly.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, I had something went wrong with my connection. So I would like to conclude by saying that the gross national philosophy has served the purpose of balancing our development. And we are proud to say that we have pledged, before anyone else did, that we will remain carbon neutral for all times to come. And I think this is coming into the global discourses now. We have taken up nature-based solutions long before these came into the discourse now. So overall, without harming our culture, without affecting our environment, Bhutan has, I think, pursued a very successful development path. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation and a glimpse into the amazing work that's happening in Bhutan. We have some questions coming into the chat. I'm just going to kick it off with one. In the last slide, you talked about melting glaciers and the impacts of climate change, and this is happening worldwide to communities that rely on glacial melt for agriculture, for hydropower. I'm wondering if there are some lessons that Bhutan has done in terms of like, how do you manage for climate change? Are there things that you've learned that kind of help farmers get through this or help the country sort of manage a change that they have very little control over? You're muted.
This is the million-dollar question because while we try our best within our borders, try our best to mitigate the rise, mitigate carbon emission and also, try to protect our environment and so on. But I think it is not in our control because air pollution, if you take, for example, doesn't stop at our borders. Many of the pollutants and the sources of emissions are not in our control. So we can hardly do anything to reduce the impact of climate change, but in our own way, we are trying to adapt to climate change. Now, for example, as I mentioned, too little water is becoming a serious problem. The water sources are drying up in many areas. And the other phenomena we see is also the unseasonal rainfall pattern. So we have rainfall when it is not needed and no rainfall, long spells of drought when we must need rain. So these are the patterns we see, and we are trying to now adapt to this by, for example, to deal with the scarcity of water, we are getting into water harvesting, rainwater harvesting, saving this water so that they can be used during the dry spell. We are also now working with the current institution where I am working, the ICIMOD, to revive some of the springs which have dried up, through a 6-step approach, including studying the hydrogeological formation and then looking at how we can bring back those springs to life. So there are many, and of course in agriculture we have done very well, as I mentioned. We are trying to minimize the use of chemicals as much as possible and to go for more drought resistant species, more pest resistant species of crops and varieties that I think, and banking on the traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge. So these are some of the practices that we are taking up to adapt to climate change.
Thank you so much. you got cut off just as about when you were going to tell us a joke. And so we have a number of people asking if you could finish the joke,
Okay,
if you
so
wouldn't mind.
let me start again. So life expectancy sometime way back in the 70s, was recorded as 48 years for Bhutanese life expectancy. So, and then one of our colleagues at that time was studying in Australia, and then he was telling his friends, if I go back to Bhutan, now I think he was around 46 years old when he was studying. If I go back to Bhutan, I have only 2 more years to live because at 48 I will die. So that was the situation. But now we have come to a stage where our life expectancy is up to 70 years. So that is the difference between from the 70s to 2020. We have come very far, almost doubling the number of years that we expect to live. So that was it. So he didn't want to come back to Bhutan because he thought he will die at 48.
So most of us in this audience also can rest assured that we can go to Bhutan and still have time to visit. Thank you for doing finishing the story. It's a great success story as well. So there's a number of questions that are sort of related to globalization and how you see globalization changing the sort of attitudes, the beliefs around nature. So the question is written here is, do you foresee conceptualizations of nature changing in rural areas where present beliefs in local bone deities and their territories remain strong? How can domestic and international development projects better integrate local perspectives and traditional knowledge in their decision-making strategy? And the question above that in the Q&A is very similar. Thank you, Dr. Pema Gyamtsho, for a wonderful presentation. Bhutan has long been a much needed leader on the global stage in terms of its commitment and practice of carbon neutrality. As Bhutan prepares to graduate to middle income status with a strong middle class, consumption and construction will continue to grow. While this is a great accomplishment, it will also lead to more emissions. So we have a question about sort of carbon emissions looking forward and a question about sort of concepts of nature and sort of changing attitudes.
Right. I think that is a big challenge. Now, as everywhere else, the impact of globalization, exposure to all sorts of things that are, not necessarily needed, but wanted. I think that is also taking place in Bhutan. And, the peer pressure, if you look at the school children, somebody has a new iPhone or, new laptop and the other one also wants it, so there's a lot of pressure on parents, so that kind of challenges are there, and how we can manage this are quite serious challenges looking ahead. But so far we have dealt with the impacts or the influences from outside quite well. Now one example is tourism. Now everywhere else, mountains are open to climbing, so mountaineering is a very fashionable form of tourism. But in Bhutan, I'm sure you know that mountaineering is not allowed or is banned, is off limit, because what happened was when some expeditions tried to climb one mountain peak, then there was a very, very disastrous hailstorm, and that killed so many yaks. And then the herders got together and approached the king. That time, our fourth king, and pleaded for to ban mountaineering because that is sort of displeasing the deities and also disturbing the sanctity of the mountains, and that is causing disasters. So as a result, then from there on, mountaineering is off limit in Bhutan, and more than 20 peaks above 20,000 feet in Bhutan are actually still devoid of human intervention, or not, not being intruded upon by human beings. So we believe that we don't have to step our foot on every corner of the earth. Now, carbon emission. Now that is a challenge. There are so many choices ahead of us. Now, the biggest challenge is, of course, we want to go for electric vehicles. We want to go for public transport. But where do we find the resources? So those are the choices we have to make. We want to actually avoid building large hydropower plants. Instead save the fish, the beautiful mashir fish that we have in our rivers. But it's a choice between saving the mashir or the, generating revenue for running our healthcare programs, running our education programs. So these are the challenges ahead of us, and we have to find ways and means of addressing them.
Thank you very much. There's a couple questions about farming. And so one person writes, can you expand a little bit on what steps Bhutan takes to reduce dependency on farming? And the other person wrote that, how close are you to sort of getting to 100% organic? I know it was a goal a couple years back. Dr. Gomez and I taught a class, and some students did a project on Bhutan. It was one of the few countries that had sort of committed to 100% organic. So I'd love an update about 8 years later.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor. And I'll take up that last question first. Now, there is a little bit of a miscommunication in terms of 100% organic. Actually, I was responsible for declaring that at the Rio Plus 20 summit. During that time, what we mentioned there in my statement was that we would like to aspire for 100% organic farming. So we want to start a movement in terms of reducing the dependence on chemicals, chemical fertilizers and chemical weedicides, pesticides, and gradually move towards 100% organic farming. So it is an aspiration. It is a sort of a motivation for us. But we did not set a target, like 2025 we want to go 100% organic, or 2030 we want to go 100. So it's not like that, because in agriculture it's about food, and we cannot control nature. Anytime one of our main food crops, for example wheat or rice, could be attacked by a certain pest, and we have to be able to respond to that in that kind of a situation. So declaring 100% organic and having laws to enforce it may not be practical, but aspiring to go 100% organic, that is the difference. So I would like to explain that upfront. Now, in terms of offloading from agriculture, that is already happening. We are trying to integrate agriculture, farming, with other economic activities. For example, agrotourism and ecotourism. So we have also in the villages, we are trying to now, the youth who are after school, if they go back to the villages, we are trying to help them establish micro businesses, enterprises. For example, production of herbal products. Getting in Bhutan has very rich diversity of herbal plants, medicinal plants. So there's scope for our youth to get engaged in small businesses like that, agro industries, and as I mentioned, tourism. Now more and more youth in the urban areas are getting into other occupations like teaching, private sector participation in the form of setting up vehicle maintenance workshops, or construction sector. So the offloading from farming is taking place. What we have now a challenge is trying to bring back the youth into farms, and that is the challenge, rather than not having enough employment on the farms. Sorry, Colin, you are muted.
There are two questions related to sort of wildlife management. So how much problem do you have with poaching, and also sort of cutting of trees? And so what's the mechanism of that? And then after you answer that question, I'm going to pass it over to Daphne, who has a story to share.
Okay, let me take up the poaching first. Now, poaching, generally, Bhutanese are not into hunting and poaching. But we do have an isolated incidences of poaching. Few individuals getting into the business. Particularly, we have these musk deer. The musk spots are very, very expensive. So there's poaching of deers, and occasionally tigers and leopards and so on. But carries very severe punishment and penalties. So there's a total ban on hunting and also trading in wildlife products. So poaching is very, very minimal. In fact, the biggest problem we have is human-wildlife conflict. Wild animals, predating on domestic cattle or sheep, or wild herbivores predating on crops and so on. So there's a serious human-wildlife conflict there. Even when wild boars destroy the entire crop of families, the farmers do not retaliate by killing the wild boars. Actually, they expect the government to come and kill them. By the time government gets there, the wild boars would have already escaped into the forest. So it's not much. So poaching, I think that's not a very serious problem. And timber, the illegal felling of trees, of course, that also happens, but not it by any scale, to the extent that we should be alarmed about, because export of timber in raw or log form is also not allowed. So we only allow export of processed, the value-added timber products, example, furnitures or other forms of wooden finished products. So we do not export the timber and logs directly. So that has reduced the incentive for illegal felling. Let me just give one example. Now, forest fires happen very often in Bhutan, but then the whole community immediately leave whatever they are doing and go and voluntarily participate in putting off the fire. Not because they are aware of the science behind it, or they're, conscious about the economic value, but more so because they want to save lives. Any life, insects or birds or animals that you save from the forest fire is sort of your ticket to a better life in the next reincarnation. So people's belief in that is very strong. So that is why in Bhutan, and as soon as forest fire happened, uh, immediately we have the communities responding to it. So those are just some examples. Thank you.
Thank you. Daphne, please share your thoughts.
I just wanted to go back and address the question about cultural beliefs and how those can be perpetuated with modernization. So Bhutan has absolutely beautiful and enormous variety of rhododendrons, which bloom in the spring between February and April. So as you drive or hike way up high in the mountains, you see these spots of colors all over the place, and they're just absolutely stunning. However, rhododendron wood is also quite good firewood. So on one of these trips where I was in a very remote village up at 14,000 feet, I saw that one side of a mountain was absolutely covered with rhododendron and stunningly beautiful. And the other side was much less sparse. And I asked, well, that seems a bit strange. I wonder how that happened. And it was explained to me that the local deity lives on that side of the mountain. Amjomo, that's her territory. No one goes there. They are not allowed to picnic. They're not allowed to collect firewood. That's her territory, and we don't disturb her. Whereas the side of the mountain that is not her territory is free reign for collecting firewood, or I know it's not particularly allowed in Bhutan, but the reality is people do need firewood. So there's this natural balance of the inherent respect for this local deity and her terrain. And we will watch very carefully as young people grow up. Will they continue to respect that? Will the cultural mores of their parents and their forefathers that tells them you're not allowed to go there, will they continue to respect that? And I think a lot of that really will depend on the cultural strength, the continued cultural and religious strength of raising young people in Bhutan. So we can all watch and see how that goes. But if they continue as the land of happiness, I think it bodes well for them.
If I may, Daphne, you forgot that we are not even allowed to pass gas in that area. Otherwise, ill luck will fall on us. So farmers, people are very conscious about those things. Desecrating those areas. Now including the spirit houses. If you are nearby them, you have to be very careful not to even fell a tree. So these beliefs are still very much alive.
That's wonderful. I'm thinking about your some of your work with ICIMOD, and one of the things you really highlighted today is this emphasis on gross national happiness, and sort of the role of Buddhism and sort of really being fundamental to the respects to nature. And I'm wondering if this is something that you see happening across the countries and across the cultures. You mentioned earlier there are 1,000 different languages, or more than 1,000 in the area where you're working now. And I was wondering how pervasive and how are people in those mountain areas collaborating in a similar way, learning from Bhutan learning from them. Could you talk a little bit about the collective work that you're doing now?
Thank you very much. I think the strength of this organization, the International Center of Integrated Mountain Development, is that it is the only platform where we get scientists from the member countries. This is quite a sensitive geopolitical area. We have Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, India, Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. So as you can see, the constellation is quite, tricky, if you like. For want of a better word, let me say that. So this is the only institution that can bring our scientists from China and India and Pakistan and others sitting across the table and sharing knowledge, sharing information, sharing data. So at least in the field of science, climate science, for example, or in rural development or innovations, technologies, there's a lot of exchange going on. Now in the social sciences, in the philosophical aspects, of course, because we come from such diverse backgrounds, we have to, I think, no one size fits all policy. I think it will not work. We have to adapt to the context, the local context, the local, the cultural context also. For example, what would work in Bhutan may not necessarily work in Afghanistan. And the challenges are different also. This is a region, like we have the driest parts in Afghanistan, Pakistan, excuse me, to the wettest spot on earth, Cherrapunji in northeast India, where we have the highest rainfall. So all these variations, the physical variation, the cultural variation will have to be taken into account. But among the ethnic groups, what is common all across is the respect for nature. That is inbuilt in their belief, in their tradition, and that makes my work also easier. And now we try to inculcate the need for balanced development. We're also promoting nature-based solutions, and building resilience of communities is one of our main objectives.
I don't know what this means, so I'm going to read it, and I hope it's Kadrin Shela for the wonderful talk. And maybe you could tell us what that means.
Kadrin Chela is thank you.
Okay.
So whoever wrote that, thank you very much. Again, there's one aspect I think Daphne would probably remember. Generally, Bhutanese don't say goodbye, but say lok jegi, means see you again. So there's no goodbye. We always see you again. So
yeah. Well, we do have time for one more question, so I'm going to take this one from the chat. Dr. Gyamtsho, thank you so much for your talk. On slide 12, you pictured Yartsa gunbu, the caterpillar fungus, which was beautiful, an extremely valuable natural resource in the high Himalayas. It's thought to be valuable for migrant fungus pickers and has been really important to socioeconomic and development, and it has, could you speak more to how Bhutan has managed this resource, particularly in the contrast in Nepal's approach or lack thereof, which I don't know exactly the context? Can this resource be sustainably developed going forward?
Right. Thank you very much for that question. Again, one example of the challenges of climate change. Now, the habitat for this particular, the fungus is also shrinking because there is a vertical ascent of the warming of, the global warming. So there is the invasion of more, species which are used to warmer climates moving up. And this Yatza Gumbub, or literally translating, it means summer grass, winter insect. Summer grass, winter insect. Yatza Gumbub. It means in summer it is in the shape of grass or fungus, and in winter it becomes a caterpillar. So this is found right at the snow line, just about 4,500 meters and above. Now, as temperatures warm up, the habitat is shrinking. So there would be, sometime down the line, it might disappear altogether. So is the case with snow leopard. Now, the snow leopard territories are now being encroached upon by tigers. That we have seen even in Bhutan now already. But coming back to this Yatza Gumbo, the sustainable collection of this species. In Bhutan, we looked at it, we studied the morphology, the physiology of this, and we have scientists, some scientists actually recommending that, because it takes hours and hours to find one. So the recommendation was, if you find two, pick one and leave one. This is totally impractical. So what we have done is, we have now limited the time they could collect this fungus. So in the month of May, we allow them to collect, and then by end of June, it is forbidden to go and collect. Then some of the spores would remain for the next generation. So that is the approach we have taken, and we have only allowed the immediate communities the right to collect it, and not everyone could go. And whereas in some other countries, I think everyone just leave their jobs and rush to the mountains to collect. So which is much more, putting much more pressure on this resource, as well as the alpine environment in general. But this is a serious challenge. I think, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it has enhanced the income of the yak herders, the people living up there. On the other hand, they have become quite rich with it, and giving up yak herding. So while these courtesies may not be sustainable, the yak herding is sustainable form. So we are trying to revert back, asking them to invest back into livestock rearing and so on. So this is also a serious challenge. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I think I've learned so much about how we can learn from Bhutan in terms of how we manage resources in a community context in order for it to be sustained in the long term. And I really look forward to meeting you again. And I'd like to take this time to have everybody thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Colin, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to, including me in this Hope Cunningham lecture series. And I also look forward to having other opportunities. And you are most welcome to this part of the world. Thank you very much. Thank
you.